The First World War, the most brutal, savage, civilization-crushing war of all time, has had a history within itself around the topic of blame. Who was to blame for the origins of such a war? This question has never really been answered, or rather it has been answered in thousands of different ways over the last decade, each historian seemingly coming up with their own explanation, making it the most debated historical topic in history. The tale begins in the realm of primary sources as governments from different nations began creating their colour books, and not the fun kind. Colour books are basically government reports that try and justify their own actions and decisions and pin blame on others in times of great error like this one. They were propaganda, and many countries omitted a lot of important information that incriminated themselves, so they cannot really be fully trusted. Most of these original books had been published only a few weeks after war broke out, and they were full of government documents and transcribed recordings of important conversations, laying the groundwork for those early historians to try and grasp what had actually happened. By the end of the war, this blame game evolved a step further with the Treaty of Versailles, where the Germans had to accept the War Guilt Clause, which basically said it was all Germany's fault. Clear and simple. Germany lost, so Germany was to blame. Some of you may complain about history being written by the victor. I say tough luck. If you don't like it, don't be the loser. During the 1920s, German historians began to publish their version of events, mostly pronouncing their nation's innocence as a counter to the Treaty of Versailles. And the American historians, around this time, took a more equal approach, blaming everybody to a small degree, but mostly seeing Germany as the victim, likely inspired by the suffering they saw the Germans go through as a result. The biggest name here being Sidney Fay. Fay mostly blamed the secret alliances, which made diplomacy practically impossible at the time, as no one really knew the full extent of the alliances. A student of his, inspired by this idea at the time, went on to create the board game Diplomacy, based on this idea of secret alliances spiralling into war. This idea fits with America culturally, as they stepped back to argue both the moral case of geopolitics, hence their support of Germany, and the isolationist case, hence their belief everyone held some blame. A fair, equal approach, unlikely to antagonise many. As for historical figures, the Kaiser reported at this time to say that no country was to blame, and that it was instead the fault of the Jews and the Freemasons interfering in politics. This was done to try and win favour with the public of all nations, not just his own, in the hope he would someday be called back to rule Germany again. On the other side, Lenin also shared his opinions, blaming imperialism and the capitalist private monopolies. The greed of leaders was also a key theme, particularly those leaders of Tsarist Russia. This was done for legitimacy, to keep the people hating their former Tsar, bolstering the Bolshevik position. One historian, Luigi Albertini, went the extra mile in his 3-volume publication on the origins of the conflict. Albertini interviewed many key figures from several different countries, and his study of the conflict was the deepest at the time. Albertini was critical of Germany, but modest, never arguing the popular belief that Germany wanted war. Yet there are many gaps in his work, as, for example, the information coming from Russia was very limited, if correct at all. To not have the information from one of the major powers makes his work sadly less relevant with time. As National Socialism took its hold in Germany, many of their historians would come to blame the Entente powers of Russia, France and Britain, bound together in a conspiracy led by the Jews. But the subject was mostly pushed back as the Second World War took centre stage. Fritz was the first historian to be granted full access to all German documents, and from there he published his infamous book, translated to The Grasp for World Power, and targets Germany almost exclusively. German leaders, Fischer argued, were worried about the increasing support for the Social Democratic Party among the public. He argued that the war was then planned by the German leaders to try and boost patriotic fervour in favour of the current regime in Germany, that of the Kaiser and his authoritarian hold over the empire. War came about, and the people took to the streets to chant in celebration of it. With the Reichstag under one government, they went to war. If they won, the Kaiser would be popular again and have the support of the people. His main evidence for this involved documents he uncovered about the War Council meeting of 1912. Basically, in this meeting, the Kaiser and his military entourage apparently met in 1912 to talk about how they were planning on dragging Europe to war. The result was a split between historians. Some, such as John Roll, became like disciples to Fischer, supporting his claims almost religiously, putting heavy blame on the Kaiser. Others did the same, but against, arguing the diaries of the people that were there clearly suggest that no such war plans were decided upon. The debate is still ongoing. Likewise, another meeting used as evidence is the fact that the German leadership met early on during the war to talk about war aims and wild goals that they could someday force upon the Allies in the event of victory. This was the September programme, and here is what the German leadership had decided upon. Fischer argues that this excitement for victory after the war had started somehow means that they wanted it from the very start. This is how I see it. The War Council meeting. A bunch of lads meet up, have a few drinks, and talk about the glory of the good old days and their dreams of a triumphant war, and boast to each other about how extreme they will take it, to try and look cool. Put a load of young 18-year-old undergraduate historians into a room, give them some drinks, have them talk about the Second World War, and naturally you will hear some outrageous stuff. Boys will be boys. I think historians look too deeply and seriously into these meetings. Were they giddy and excited for victory and war? Yes, but many leaders got excited and found the moving around of pieces on a global board like a fun game. Historians such as Arno Meyer, a Marxist historian, take Fischer a step further and argue that the fear of the people gaining power being a cause of war was present in all nations, not just Germany. Therefore, all the leaders conspired to some extent to bring on this war, using populism and nationalism to trick the people. Fischer also argued that the Second World War was just a continuation of the First. He argued that the Germany of 1914 dreamed of Lebensraum and the colonisation of Russian land with Germans. After the Second World War, naturally there was quite a bit of anger towards Germany, so Fischer's ideas were picked up with enthusiasm by many, particularly given it was coming from a German himself. These ideas became known as the Fischer School, and contains historians such as Emanuel Geiss, John Roll, Hans Ulrich Wehler, and Wolfgang Momsen, to name a few, and still had radical support even up until 2011. But interestingly, this theory had taken a rapid nosedive in popularity by 2014, which I will get to. Gerhard Ritter tore deep into Fischer's work just a year later in 1962 and became sort of like the Anti-Fischer. He was a German conservative, a nationalist, not on the level that had existed 20 years prior, by no means, but still believed it to be sad that many young Germans, on top of growing up with the guilt felt by the Second World War, would now have to add the First onto that. Ritter's argument is more defensive and claims Germany pushed to war because it was the only way they could protect their ally, Austria-Hungary, and if they lost Austria-Hungary, they would then be surrounded by enemies. Other theories emerged later in the 1960s, which drifted away from the topic of blame. André Hillgruber began the calculated risk theory. The Germans felt that they were surrounded by the Entente, and of course this terrified them. Therefore, Germany took advantage of the assassination and backed Austria-Hungary as much as possible. Russia was willing to back Serbia, yet it was hoped by Germany that France and Britain would see sense and not think such a war would be worth this random state in the Balkans. The hope was they would back out, Russia would be angry with them, and the alliance would fall apart, whereas their alliance with Austria-Hungary, who they shared a massive border with, would be secure. However, the British and French were willing to get involved, and so, in a sense, the two sides called each other's bluff. None could back down, and it eventually slipped from their control into war. Another argument comes from A.J.P. Taylor, who created the war by timetables theory. This idea argued that the military timetables had become so extremely precise that any pivot away from them would lead to devastation. For example, Germany could mobilise much faster than a country like Russia. The fear for Russia was that if both sides began mobilising at the same time, then Germany would have their army fully ready and on the march weeks before Russia could, losing a lot of land in the early stages of the war. For Germany, they feared a war on two fronts, so introduced the Schlieffen Plan. This plan was to storm through Belgium, take Paris, knock the French out of the war, then go all in on Russia, avoiding the two-front war. But then the assassination happened, and Russia began a partial mobilisation. Russia has to assume war is coming, so needs to begin mobilising to at least have some troops on the field, which can slow down the enemy advance. Germany had little options. If they assume war is coming, they need to begin marching into Belgium now, or they will lose. If they assume war is not coming, then all is fine. If you were in this scenario, what would you do? The safest bet for Germany is to attack. Therefore, no one was to blame. They felt the need to suddenly go to war to avoid annihilation. Christopher Clark, in his book The Sleepwalkers, published in 2012, brought a lot of new life into the topic, as he brought the narrative back to the Balkans. Clark focused on the history of the Balkans and the balance of power, arguing Russia and Austria-Hungary were battling it out in a sort of Cold War for control over the new countries emerging from the collapsing Ottoman Empire. No country is of any particular blame, and they all took a series of risks trying to gain a minor upper hand which slipped out of control. The secret alliances are also blamed, as Clark's arguments go back to those of Faye, mentioned earlier. In a sense, they all sleepwalked into war. None were awake enough to realise what was happening before it was too late. I would 100% recommend this book as the place to start if you really want to learn more. This is where the massive step away from Fischer's ideas really became noticeable, as young modern historians generally prefer less finger-pointing and blame. This is part of a new revisionist approach to history, and before people jump in and talk about the politics of revisionism, revisionism really means that history is looked back on with new facts and ideas. It is neither good nor bad, left-wing nor right-wing. Some are good, some are bad. Some revisionists are radically leftist, some radically on the right. I say this because it has unfortunately become a popular buzzword in American politics, and like everything American politics does, it takes European words and gives them new, random, incorrect meanings which confuse everybody. But I digress. Sean McMeekin wrote The Russian Origins of the First World War. This is a fascinating book that, on the one hand, argues the war was, to some extent, a war of the Ottoman succession. As the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, the other powers were looking at their chance to strike and create something akin to the scramble for Africa, and the victor of this war would take most of the spoils, which historically happened to some extent. On the other hand, McMeekin puts a lot of blame onto Russia and Russia's ministers. McMeekin is one of the only major historians to actually pin the blame on Russia. As much as I love his ideas and think to a massive extent parts of it are true, he is onto something, I don't think it is foolproof. It falls apart in some areas, as it seems like he is trying to bend the narrative and several quotes to try and fit them into his idea from time to time. But apart from these issues, it is overall very good. Another book of McMeekin's is called July 1914, which breaks down that fateful month day by day to get a deep sense of what actually happened across Europe during those final months. A must read. Dominic Neven, also a Russianist historian, talks about Russia having a weak Tsarist regime, alongside there being an aggressive Germany and an Austro-Hungarian Empire blinded by its own arrogance. James Joll and John Keegan argue that diplomacy had basically completely failed. Not enough people were talking to those on the other sides of the borders to figure it out. They kept themselves too close to their own military staff and allies, not hearing out the other side. Tim Butcher made a strong defence of Serbia and dedicated his book to disproving the possible involvement of the Serbian government in the assassination, stating that they had no idea of the planned actions of the Black Hand. The debate here still continues. Samuel Williamson focuses on the Austro-Hungarian Empire and how the multi-ethnicity of the empire led to war. An independent, successful Serbia might make the other cultures within the Habsburg Empire's borders think in a similar way and try to break free, dismantling the empire from within due to a surge in nationalism. Margaret Macmillan blames the war on select people, the leaders of Germany, Russia and Austria-Hungary, for a series of mistakes. Neil Ferguson tries to pin the blame on Britain and their Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, for being anti-German and misreading Germany. This, he believed, caused Anglo-German relations to break down, which led to war. Ferguson is an economic historian. When he talks economics, I like what he says, and I often agree. But I have to admit, when he talks geopolitics, at least with what I have read, it is utter nonsense, which is a shame. Just read The Pity of War, and you will understand. A lot of these modern theories start to avoid looking into the big causes and origins, and instead focus in detail on small aspects, which would have had a great impact. For example, Zara Steiner argues that Germany threatened British interests, so Britain had to take a hard stance against Germany. Now, this did not lead to war, but merged with the theory that Germany felt itself surrounded by Britain also, means that Steiner's argument sheds new light on how that topic might be viewed. There are many of these small ideas that avoid the grandeur. Sadly, far too many to cover. But if you want to learn more, then I advise a work by Holger Herwig and Richard Hamilton, who have edited books that are compilations of these smaller ideas contributed to by many historians in a collection. These I'd highly recommend if you want your first introduction to the more in-depth, complicated ideas. If you have never read anything on this topic before and want to get started, I would strongly suggest War by Timetables by Taylor. Then, if you want to go deeper, Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers. And then, if you want to take a step further, Sean McMeekin's July 1914. If you want some more interesting, controversial opinions, the Herwig and Hamilton edited works of The Origins of the First World War and The Outbreak of World War I are what I would advise. Comment down below your own thoughts on this topic. I would love to hear some new, interesting, creative ideas. In truth though, remember that nobody really knows the true cause. We all just have different opinions and points of view, so please play nice down there in my comment section. Thank you for watching.